Lucius Aemilius Regillus, Praetor 190 BCE. The younger brother of one of his generation's icons, Lucius Aemilius Regillus was overshadowed by his brother during his own lifetime. However, in the long run, he became an object of fascination in his own right to both later generations of Romans and to modern students of Rome due to his role in Rome's War of the Seleucid Empire. Taking over the Roman fleet in 190, Regillus presided over the last noteworthy fleet action prior to the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Despite a somewhat inauspicious beginning, and frankly having never demonstrated any overt signs of military talent, he nonetheless defeated the Seleucid fleet at Myonessus and set the stage for Scipio's army to cross the Hellespont to fight and win the Battle of Magnesia. Here is the story of a man who was rather mediocre, but had the great good fortune of commanding in a golden period when the Middle Republic exclusively fielded high-quality forces. Even more to the point, Lucius Aemilius Regillus would benefit more from the skill and dedication of his allies than nearly any other Roman commander to serve on land or sea. This is the almost epic story about a Roman who played the game on very easy with the cheat menu enabled. Like many Romans who went on to achieve great things, Regillus was born into incredibly favorable circumstances. His broader family, the patrician gens Aemilii, was highly respected and had produced many consuls over the years since the Republic was founded. His own father was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a two-time consul. The elder Lepidus died in 216. Most likely he died at the Battle of Cannae, where so many other senior Romans met their end. With the elder Lepidus dead, it was up to Lucius and his older brother Marcus, and perhaps their younger brother Quintus as well, to organize a funeral for dear old dad. And during this time, one of the brothers, presumably Marcus the eldest, decided that gladiator games should be held as a part of the elder Lepidus's funeral. This seems to have been the very first time anyone in Roman politics had done this at a political funeral, and thereafter it became a staple. So most likely this was Lucius's older brother who invented the practice of having gladiatorial games at funerals, but there is a chance that it was actually Lucius who was the one who came up with this idea. He would have been a teenager already, and he probably thought that gladiators were kind of neat. Speaking of the older brother, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, he would go on to become one of the truly great men in Roman politics, especially in the 180s. So Marcus's great ascent would be a bit after Regulus's famous naval command in 190. Marcus would go on to achieve the consulship in 187, later becoming censor and princeps senatus. Regulus, as we'll see, did not quite ascend to those heights, and so he spent most of his prime years in the shadow of his more famous older brother. The two also have another brother, probably younger than them, named Quintus, who does not really seem to have made his way into the pages of history, and the reasons for that, of course, are unknown. The War of the Seleucid Empire began in 192 when Antiochus III entered Greece, and the Romans decided that they must be expelled. Most likely, Regillus, as someone who was planning to run for praetor in a couple years' time, felt like there would be at least a chance he would get to prove himself as praetor. Given the resources of the Seleucid Empire, he may have also felt that the war would still be raging in another 5 years or so, when he might even serve as consul. That being said, it must have been a pleasant surprise when he was selected to take part as one of the commanders in the conflict. In 190, after he was elected praetor, he was dispatched by the Roman Senate to go to the Aegean and take command of the fleet from the existing commander, Gaius Livius Salinator. Regillus would now become the third Roman admiral to command the Aegean fleet in the War with the Seleucid Empire. Unlike his predecessor, Regillus would not bring any reinforcements. He would be using the same fleet that Livius Salinator had worked with, and this fleet would have to be enough to get the job done, at least for now. The Romans perhaps thought that the war might drag on another year or two, and perhaps they had provisions in place to send additional vessels. At any rate, during his year, Regillus could not expect anything of the sort. He had 58 existing quinquiremes, and he also had a number of different ship types that were provided by his Rhodian and Attalid allies. The Attalids, like the Romans, were not the best naval power, but they weren't terrible either, whereas the Rhodians were truly elite, even if their ships were not of the heaviest and most advanced designs. As for Regillus, he didn't even get ships to transport himself to the east. He was sent without any ships to escort him. So he had to arrive in Greece and then send word to Livius Salinator in order to be fetched and delivered to the fleet he was supposed to command. This means that his command got off to a little bit of an inauspicious start, and it also was delayed by at least 2 and more probably 3 months. By the time that Regillus arrived on the scene, the Romans had firmly seized the initiative. A year or 2 prior, they had expelled the Seleucids from Greece, and they had also effectively deterred Antiochus from trying any further actions in Europe. He had even abandoned his base in Thrace that he had spent years carving out for himself. At this point, Antiochus III had more or less resolved himself to the defensive, and it was up to the Romans to take the fight to him in Asia. The first step in that would be securing naval supremacy. To that end, Regulus's predecessor, Gaius Livius Salinator, had won a battle at Kyssos, or as it's sometimes called, Corycus, and while this was a pretty impressive victory, it had not been the knockout blow that the Romans had been hoping for. It's also worth mentioning, just in passing, that there's a very good chance that the battle took place during what should have been Regulus's command period, but because of Regulus's aforementioned late arrival, this battle took place under the leadership of Livius Salinator instead. Because the Seleucid fleet escaped and was reconstituting its numbers in port, Regillus had a mission of facing down this reconstituted fleet, beating it again, and this time winning decisively enough that he could send his fleet to the north in order to assist Lucius Cornelius Scipio, the main army commander who needed to seize control of Lysimachia, the largest city in Thrace, and use that as a base from which to transport his troops over to Asia Minor. There was a good chance going in that Regulus's mission would not succeed in 1 year. However, he was determined, as one might imagine, to make things happen. In the meantime, he did receive a disturbing report. Hannibal, who had fled to Antiochus a year or 2 before, had now been given a command. This is something that the Romans would have feared. And Hannibal's new command was going to be a fleet being raised in Phoenicia, and that fleet would then be taken and used against the Romans. It would reinforce the Seleucid admiral Polyxenidas, who was at Ephesus with the main body. So Regillus obviously is going to be anxious about preventing these 2 Seleucid forces from joining, and also, like many Romans, he may very well have entertained a fear of Hannibal that bordered on the irrational. After all, Hannibal was an undoubted military genius, and it was possible that his genius would extend to the sea. In the event, perhaps those fears appeared to be a little bit overrated. In the aftermath of the Battle of Kyssos, Livius Salinator had tried to get at Polyxenidas in port at Ephesus, and those efforts had largely failed. In the meantime, in order to distract the Romans, Antiochus had made probes against Roman allies on the coast that required Livius to disperse his fleet to some extent. Regulus's first task, therefore, in preparing for a major fleet action, was to get his navy reunited in order to face down the Admiral Polyxenidas. However, in the meantime, he received disturbing news. Perhaps a little earlier than expected, Hannibal had successfully assembled his fleet, and he had set sail. When he learned that Hannibal was approaching, he turned to the Rhodian admiral Eudamos. Eudamos was possibly the best commander of the era, at least at sea, and he asked for permission to face Hannibal alone. Perhaps fearful of Hannibal, the Roman Praetor decided that it was best to trust the expertise of the Rhodians and let them handle it. After all, it would be better to allow an ally to take a thrashing at the hands of the great general than to allow something to happen to yet another Roman force. Eudamos was equal to the task. He and Hannibal fought each other at Cidae, and in a hard-fought struggle, the Phoenician fleet was defeated by the Rhodians. However, this was not a decisive battle, and despite his experience and his better, more experienced fleet, Eudamos was not able to completely smash Hannibal's fleet. The Phoenician vessels, most of them were damaged, and Eudamos, despite winning the battle, also had 10 of his 38 ships effectively knocked out of commission for a while, requiring repair. So this meant that while Eudamos had emerged victorious, his fleet was damaged, and while Hannibal had been defeated, he had not been destroyed, and his fleet still existed. If he repaired it in time, he potentially still could manage to rejoin Polyxenidas. That, of course, raises the issue of whether Hannibal's genius extended to the sea, and the results are somewhat ambivalent. I would have to say that his genius did extend to the sea to some extent, since obviously he was able to hold his own against a superior force and a much more seasoned naval commander. Eudamos returned north to Regulus's fleet, but he only brought 22 ships with him. The damaged ships, along with a few others, had to be left behind in order to keep an eye on Hannibal. The Rhodian ships that Eudamos brought were mostly on the smaller side. These were certainly not quinquiremes. They may have been triremes or quadriremes. But given the quality of the crew and the quality of their commander, they were still an asset and might even prove decisive. However, this new gain was partially offset by Regulus's need to allow his Attalid allies to go home. There was political pressure to have them close at hand because Antiochus's main army was now attacking Pergamon directly. The crews could not really be relied upon to perform if their homeland was being ravaged by the Seleucid army. And so, Regulus's numbers had been reduced somewhat, but he did have the highest quality ships on his side. Hannibal's fleet was still extant, but it was still undergoing repairs. And because Eudamos had not knocked them out, he would either have to go back and try again if Hannibal set sail once more, or Regulus would have to face the possibility of dealing with both Seleucid fleets at once, something that he didn't want to do as an inexperienced admiral. And so his decision was to try to force battle with Polyxenidas as quickly as possible before Hannibal arrived. He wanted to defeat his enemy in detail, so this is a solid strategic decision. For his part, Polyxenidas was also under some pressure. We're not sure exactly the orders, but most likely Antiochus was putting pressure on him to do something. And it's also possible that, being someone with pride, Polyxenidas did not want to win a battle alongside of Hannibal because he was well aware of who would get all the credit. After all, no one had really heard of Polyxenidas until the year before or so, and he had not really done all that much of note, but Hannibal sure as hell had, and so anyone hearing about the battle would clearly think that Hannibal was responsible if things went well. It appears that the Seleucid strategy was the result of direct coordination between Antiochus III and his admiral. Antiochus took his main army to attack the Greek city of Notium on the coast. Notium was a pretty notable place and also had a relationship with Rome. The Romans, for their part, politically wanted to gain the favor of the Greeks by any means possible. And so, to save a city in this way would help their standing with all of the Greeks, including the Greeks of the mainland, who were still a little unsure about the Romans. For political reasons, therefore, Regulus had no choice but to bail out Notium. This would create an opportunity for the Seleucid fleet under Polyxenidas to intercept and destroy the Roman fleet on its way there. Polyxenidas had about 90 ships, and his plan was effectively to ambush the Romans at sea. He wanted to catch them when they were half in and half out of a harbor near Cape Myonessus. But this plan failed because the Rhodians were present, and they knew this area very well. Now, it's worth noting, just before we go too far, that Polyxenidas himself was a Rhodian, but an exile. So he too had been a naval commander for the Rhodians before he was kicked out. That means that the guy he was facing, Eudamos, was someone that he would know, and someone who clearly understood the same exact things that he did. Polyxenidas does have one big disadvantage, though, and that is that his crews are all inexperienced landlubbers. The Seleucids had no naval tradition, and that's partly why Antiochus was entrusting his fleet to the land general Hannibal and a Rhodian exile. Polyxenidas' attempt to achieve surprise failed because the Rhodians were aware of all of the potential spots for ambushes, and so perhaps Eudamos knew ahead of time this would happen, or he simply took the precaution of scouting carefully. When the two fleets lined up to fight, Polyxenidas did not achieve surprise and therefore could not fight the Romans half at a time, but he still had the numerical edge. And in terms of the quality and weight of his ships, he had an edge over the Rhodian vessels because the Seleucid fleet was new, much like the Roman fleet. That being said, that 10-ship advantage, while not necessarily decisive, was comforting, and Polyxenidas had a pretty good chance of winning the battle when things started. While Polyxenidas had not achieved surprise the way that he might have hoped, he had caught the Romans and Rhodians in a situation where their deployment was less than ideal. The Rhodian vessels, which were lighter and more maneuverable, were on the inland side of the fleet, so they were not able to use all of their maneuverability. So Eudamos quickly saw the problem and redeployed his men in the middle of battle. Some have speculated that he must have communicated this to Regillus ahead of time, otherwise the Romans might have thought that the Rhodians were turning traitor or turning coward on them. So Eudamos and his men skillfully drew back and then sailed around the Romans to the right flank, the offshore flank, and this gave them greater maneuverability and prevented the Seleucids from attacking from the seaward flank with their slight numerical edge. That's really the only detail we have about the battle. The only thing that we know is that Eudamos' move, and because that's the only thing that's recorded, it's safe to assume that this must have been the decisive move, because after this, the battle turned into a fairly substantial and one-sided affair. Regillus and the Rhodians lost only 3 ships, whereas half of Polyxenidas' ships were either sunk or captured. So Myonessus turned out to be a smashing success, and one that clearly owed primarily to the expertise of the Rhodians and their excellent admiral Eudamos. In the final analysis, the Battle of Myonessus was a decisive victory for the Romans. Sure, it wasn't big enough on its own to end the Roman-Seleucid War. It also was not quite on a scale sufficient to make the war's outcome inevitable. However, it does very much set up everything that happens afterward and gave the advantage entirely to the Romans. For starters, Regillus was able to take his fleet north and escort Lucius Scipio's army into Asia without incident. The city of Lysimachia, which it was feared might put up a resistance, ended up surrendering without much of a fight, and that was a huge coup in of itself. Diplomatically, the Battle of Myonessus also most likely had the impact of making it clear to King Prusias of Bithynia that the Seleucids were beatable, and that he could work with the Romans to achieve the victory he wanted. And so he was now more willing to hear Livius Salinator, who arrived as an envoy, and he joined the side of the Romans. As for Lucius Scipio, once his forces were conveyed by Regillus, he marched inland without much incident. And all of this is despite the absence of his brother Scipio Africanus, who was supposed to accompany him on the entire campaign. Scipio Africanus had been important up to this point, but now he fell ill, and so he remained in Europe while Lucius continued to march inland. Lucius would face off against Antiochus the Great at Magnesia in early 189, and despite being massively out-generaled by Antiochus, his forces had the quality in order to win. Part of this victory is due to the fact that Antiochus had had to dilute his force somewhat in order to cover potential landing zones that were opened up by Roman diplomacy. He also had a few thousand men monitoring Bithynia. And a lot of that, again, dates back to the Battle of Myonessus, which made all these things possible. Magnesia was a very closely fought battle and came extremely close to going the way of Antiochus. So if those few thousand men had been present, who were otherwise monitoring Bithynia, then perhaps the battle would have gone differently, and Scipio's brother would not be known as Scipio Asiaticus, but simply Scipio's shitty brother. So this was a major battle in terms of setting up the war's outcome. And in the aftermath of the war, the Seleucid Empire would be greatly truncated by the Romans, and they would be disallowed from holding territory north of the Taurus Mountains. So effectively, they lost all presence in what is today Turkey. After the conclusion of the Roman-Seleucid War, Rome would never again fight a peer power. That was the last conflict when the Romans had an actual chance of losing the war. All of their subsequent wars would be against minor powers who might be able to win a battle here or there, but did not have the resources to actually press home their advantage and win the conflict. For that reason, Regillus and his contemporaries deserve a lot of credit for bringing about Rome's great victory over the Seleucids and for establishing the Romans as the last remaining major power in the Mediterranean. The Battle of Myonessus was the most significant Roman naval battle between the Battle of the Aegates Island in 241, which ended the First Punic War, and the Battle of Actium in 31, which ended the period of the Second Triumvirate and led to the establishment of the Principate under Augustus. So those are battles which clearly are more important than Myonessus, yet Myonessus still occupies a fairly significant place in Roman naval history. As for Regillus himself, he certainly was not a military genius. That being said, he did have a certain amount of judgment. He knew that the Rhodians had a good chance of beating the Phoenician fleet under Hannibal, and so he entrusted his admiral Eudamus with that task, and Eudamus delivered. Later on, he also trusted Eudamus again to pull off a risky maneuver, and this resulted in victory at Myonessus. So Regillus at least had the great good sense of realizing that he was no military genius, and that he was not a man of the sea. He also seems to have had some strategic sense, although again, most of his decisions were largely forced upon him by Antiochus and Polyxenidas, who effectively forced him to fight at Myonessus. What's interesting is that despite being the commanding admiral of this famous victory, which would later grow in fame as the memory of Rome fighting at sea would fade, Regillus would never become consul. We don't know for sure if he ever ran for it, but he certainly did not make it. And for many scholars, that is a good example of how in Rome, political success was not directly correlated with military success or failure. There were other commanders who, in Regulus's place, had lost battles in various wars and went on to become consul or even censor. Regulus is an example of someone who won, and won pretty handsomely, and still didn't really reap anything for his great victory. So this shows that during the Middle Republic, people like Regillus and others could not count on a military victory as a guaranteed ticket to the top. And this is also noteworthy because Regulus's brother, as we mentioned earlier, was one of the truly great men of this generation. Perhaps it was his brother's success that made his brother's enemies hold him back. Or perhaps when the estate was divided, the older brother, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, had gotten the vast majority of the estate, and Regulus had been left with the smaller share, and it was not enough to sustain a consular ambition. At any rate, it's clear that Regillus was still someone who was noteworthy, even if he did not quite reach the pinnacle of Roman politics. And this would be recognized later. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus the Triumvir from the 1st century would honor both of the two brothers from this generation. Now, while his namesake was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and he would honor him more, he still did look up to Regillus the Admiral. And so that means that Regillus, despite not becoming consul, was still seen as someone his descendants could take pride in. So when they were listing their ancestors, they'd always mention the famous Admiral Regillus, and they would do so with due reverence.